Hello everyone, I'm Il Chang-yi, Senior Research Coordinator at United Nations Research Institute for Social Development or UNREST. Today I'm going to talk about East Asian countries' land reform experiences and their implication for poverty and inequality reduction, with a focus on South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines. Before I talk about the specific cases of policy developments in South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines, I want to talk about social policy and land reform itself briefly. Social policy is one of the key policy tools to reduce poverty and inequality. Social policy is understood differently, but today I'm going to talk about two broad understandings of social policy. The first is social policy as a practice which refers to government-initiated policies. The other is social policy as a set of policies to deal with various problems affecting our well-being. Social policy as government-initiated policies can be found in various government activities. In general, within the government, conventional welfare policies with a focus on redistribution and protection are typically understood as social policy. Health, education, housing, pension, cash transfers, etc., are the usual subject matters of social policy within the government context. Social policy can be also understood as a set of policies to deal with various problems affecting our well-being. This understanding of social policy has a much broader concept of social policy and a broad area of discussions on social policy. Scholars and experts taking this social policy approach deal with various issues related to human well-being in various dimensions, and they include such issues as labor, industry, macroeconomy, and environment if they affect the well-being of people. And UNREST conceptualized this approach with the concept of transformative social policy and applied this concept to the research and analysis of social policy development in a development context. And it focuses on all the functions affecting the well-being of people. Therefore, it concerns production, protection, redistribution, reproduction, social cohesion and peace, and environmental protection. Therefore, land reform is one of the major topics of social policy in this transformative social policy perspective, since it has a significant impact on various functions such as production of agricultural products, protection of farmers, in particular tenants, and redistribution of wealth and power. I'm going to talk about three specific case countries, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines, from the perspective of this transformative social policy, since this transformative social policy perspective helps us to understand the developmental process of South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines better than other perspectives. Land reform is normally understood as the redistribution of property rights, especially lands for the benefits of the landless peasants, small farmers, and tenants. So it is kind of shift of wealth and power from the rich to the poor, or from the landed class to the landless. And normally this kind of land reform, which is traditional land reform, is a direct public controlled land reform based on expropriation by the government. It is an attempt to move wealth and power from the rich to the poor and from the landed class to the landless. And this kind of land reform approach was very much popular until the 1970s. Although this idea existed in the 1980s, the 1980s can be described as the lost decade, since there were not much discourse and practices on land reform in the 1980s. And in the 1990s, neoliberal idea about the land reform emerged, especially when neoliberals started discussions about transition economies. They focused on distribution of idle land and tenure security. And neoliberals' idea about the land reform was mainly based on voluntary market-driven reform. And the idea was that the land reform should not be led by the state. And neoliberals focused on the reform of insecure land tenure, outdated regulations, and dysfunctional land institutions. And third approach is populist land reform approach. We can find it in social movements in various parts of the world. And the idea is to give back the land to those who worked it. It emphasizes the importance of customary laws and history of farming by people who has lived in those lands. Some ideas have been actually legalized and implemented in different parts of the world too. All these three approaches exist these days, and policies and institutions for land reform often have all these approaches in a mixed form. Depending on which element is strong, the impact of land reform on people's well-being is also different. Today's cases of South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines are very much close to the state-led land reform, but they also had some elements of neoliberal land reforms and populist land reforms. When we analyze land reforms, we can find three different types of analytical perspectives of land reform. The first one is inward-looking perspective. This perspective looks into dynamics within land reform process. So this perspective focuses on supporting institutional improvements, better credit provision, marketing facilities, and extension and advisory services in the process of land reform. So the perspective tries to analyze land reform within the land reform process only. The second one is outward-looking perspective. This perspective looks into dynamics between land reform process on the one hand and on the other policy sectors. So the outward-looking perspective tries to look at the institutional and policy ecosystems and governance reform and macroeconomic policy linkages like trade and industrial policy, fiscal policy, social policy linkages, and democratization as well. I think if you want to analyze land reform properly, we have to have both perspectives, both inward and outward-looking perspectives. I call this approach a comprehensive perspective, which includes both inward and outward-looking perspectives. We will try to understand today's cases from this comprehensive analytical perspective. Now, let's move on to our cases. If you look at the map, you can find where South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines are. In terms of population, the Philippines is the largest, while Taiwan is the smallest. And like many other countries in the global south, they all have experienced occupation of foreign countries, such as Japan and the United States. South Korea became colonized by Japanese imperialism and was under the rule of Japanese imperialism for almost 40 years, from 1905 to 1945. And the Korean War between South Korea and the communist North Korea broke out in 1950 and continued for 3 years. Taiwan was also the colony of Japan and began to be ruled by Kuomintang government, which fled to Taiwan in 1949 after the defeat in mainland China. The Philippines has had a significant influence of the US in nation-building process after the Second World War, and the government also had a strong concern about the spread of communism. All three countries became democratized from the 1980s. With these historical backgrounds, let's look at the process of land reforms of these three countries and their linkages with other policy sectors. The land reform in South Korea was driven by exogenous factors, such as the influence of land reform in North Korea on South Korean peasants, and the US policy to prevent the spread of communism. The Korean peninsula divided into a North Korean communist regime backed up by the Soviet Russia and South Korean liberal democracy backed up by the United States. And North Korea established communist command and control economy rapidly, and one of the key measures was to take away land from the rich and distribute them to the landless. In South Korea in 1945, when the Japan surrendered and Korea became liberated from Japanese colonial regime, land was very much unevenly distributed. About top 2.7% of landlords owned two-thirds of all the cultivated lands in 1945. South Korean peasants, who were mostly tenants, were very much influenced by the land reform in North Korea, and the United States was very much worried about the increasing sympathy and support for the North Korean regime by the peasants in South Korea. Therefore, the United States, which temporarily occupied South Korea, strongly pushed the land reform process. In 1945, as soon as the U.S. military government was established, it implemented tenancy reform, which reduced the tenancy rate to a third of the original tenancy rate. Although the U.S. military government also wanted to have drastic land reform, the Korean landlords and its political alliance strongly resisted the land reform. Therefore, the U.S. military government distributed land which had been previously owned by the Japanese and tilled by Korean tenants. It was 11.7% of total cultivated land. The ceiling of the distributed land was 2 hectares, and the price of land was the 300% of the average products of that land, which would be paid by the former tenants for 15 years. The newly established Korean government also implemented land reform after a series of political fights between political groups. The government restricted the upper ceiling of land ownership to 3 hectares, redistributed 330,000 hectares, and landlords sold 500,000 hectares directly to their tenants. The lands distributed to the tenants was about 52% of total cultivated land. The price of the land was 150% of the average products of the land, and the tenants would pay them for 5 years, and the landlords whose lands were expropriated would get the payment for 5 years. One of the interesting points for this land reform was that it allowed the landlords to have an opportunity to invest the payment for the land into industries through the land bonds issued by the government. Another interesting point is that the land reform continued during the Korean War, in particular in the areas where the battle fights were not taking place. The last interesting point is about the unintended positive consequence of the government policy failure. It was the rapidly increasing inflation rate. Rapidly increasing inflation rate, in particular due to the Korean War and its economic impacts, reduced the financial burden of the tenants who bought the land in the land reform process. After the defeat in mainland China, the Kuomintang government retreated to the island of Taiwan in 1949, and state building in Taiwan started. The land distribution was also very much unequal in Taiwan. Over 50% of population in Taiwan was farmers, and about 70% of the farmers was tenants. The tenancy rate was very high, as 50 to 70% of the products. And social unrest because of these high tenancy rates took place frequently. Before Kuomintang government moved to Taiwan, the tenancy reform was already designed and implemented, and the tenancy rate was reduced to 37.5%. The tenancy reform, which is the redistribution of agricultural products, was followed by a significant land reform process based on land-to-tiller principle. The compensation for the land was paid for 10 years. Taiwanese government also included a policy tool to allow landlords to invest in industrialization through paying the stocks in government-owned industries. So the landlords received 70% of the purchase price in land bonds to be redeemed in rice or sweet potatoes with interest at 4% per annum, and the remaining 30% was paid with stocks in government-owned industries. In 1953, the policy for compulsory sale of land by landlords or land-to-tiller program was launched, and the land reform process has been almost complete in 1958. The Philippines land reform process is in contrast with South Korean and Taiwanese cases in many senses. Firstly, the U.S. government, which had a great influence in the Philippines government policy, did not pursue the land reform. Although some policy experts in the U.S. argued for the necessity for land reform in the Philippines, the U.S. government did not push the land reform strongly. The driving force was the Philippines government, which was very much worried about the communist peasant rebel groups in different parts of the country. Secondly, the government plan for land reform, however, did not include compulsory sale of landlords' lands to the tillers. The distributed land to the tillers through land reform was mainly the government-owned land, and it was very tiny as 2%. This is very much related to the political structure in the Philippines. The power structure of the Philippines was, and still is, based on oligarchy. In the Philippines, political power is owned by landlords who own large plantations, and the government captured by these landlords could not implement the radical land reforms. In simple terms, in the Philippines, if you have large plantations, many of your family members are politicians. So there will be mother who is politician and children who are politicians. And this family will have relatives who are politicians. This structure is still found in the current Philippines political structure. About 75% of lawmakers in Congress belong to the so-called political dynasties. All elected senators are millionaires. When rich families that own a large plantation are elected politicians, the government's hands are tied whenever it tries to radical reform for the landless. For instance, in the 1970s, President Marcos' decree was very much ambitious and radical on paper at least, because it allowed tenants of landlords having more than 7 hectares to purchase the lands they tilled. However, only 4% of the cultivated lands were acquired, and the number of beneficiary families was just 6 to 8% of those landless in 1985. This table shows a very good snapshot of the impact of land reform on inequality measured by Land Gini Index. Between 1945 and 1960, South Korea reduced the Land Gini Index from 0.73 to 0.38. In the same period, Taiwan reduced Land Gini Index from 0.58 to 0.39. But you cannot find any significant difference in Land Gini Index or in the Philippines between the 1950s and 1960s. The successful land distribution to tillers in South Korea and Taiwan and the failure of the Philippines resulted in a big difference in the economic status of agricultural population. The first and second picture show the structure of the agricultural population in both South Korea and Taiwan between 1945 and 1965. The number of full owners of the land increased drastically in both countries, and the number of tenants decreased dramatically. There was still significant number of tenant owner status, but they had benefited from tenancy reform, which significantly reduced the tenancy rates. In contrast, in the case of the Philippines, there was no significant change in economic status of agricultural population between 1948 and 1958. The structural changes in South Korea and Taiwan, or no change in the case of Philippines, imply many accompanied impacts in economic, social, and political dimensions. Firstly, increase the number of landowners is highly associated with increased productivity. Even the reduction of rents can positively affect the productivity. For instance, in Taiwan, tenants who became to own the land and benefited from reduced rents invested more money in agricultural equipment and improved farming methods. As such, in Taiwan, the agricultural products after the land reform and tenancy reform increased by almost 50% in 4 years in comparison with the product of the pre-land reform and tenancy reform. Secondly, increased productivity and income for agricultural households means better nutrition and health for family members and better education for their children. Thirdly, increased economic power and better education mean more political empowerment. They became farmers who can say no to the landed class or the rich who own large land. Because of this land reform in Korea and Taiwan, a lot of people moved from rural area to urban area. The figure on the left shows a significant reduction of the rural population in South Korea from the early 1960s after the land reform. In particular, many young ones of those households that became the land-owning farmers moved to urban areas for seeking for employment or education. Reduction of population in agricultural sector is one of the phenomena of structural transformation in developing countries. Key to the successful transformation is whether industrial sector or service sector has a capacity to absorb the people from rural areas and provide decent jobs to these people. In the case of South Korea and Taiwan, labor-intensive industry, in particular textile and small appliances industry, played a significant role in absorbing and providing jobs to these people from rural areas. This slide shows that in Korea, agriculture, forestry, and fishery sectors have been significantly reduced since 1965, while mining and manufacturing sector, which refers to industrial sector, has been significantly increased since 1965. This is the period when the South Korean government started industrialization based on economic development plans. The intensive industrial policy focusing on labor-intensive industries grew rapidly, and the industrial sector could absorb people, in particular young ones from rural areas. Similar phenomena can be observed in the case of Taiwan. This slide also shows a rapid growth of industrial sector in Taiwan after the early 1960s. As in the case of South Korea, Taiwanese government also established industrial plan focusing on labor-intensive industries, and these growing industrial sectors could absorb people from rural areas. This linkage between land reform and industrial policy created important synergies which contributed to full utilization of labor and increased the productivity in both rural and urban areas. In contrast, as you can see in the slide, the industrial sector of the Philippines has not made any significant change since the 1960s. In the Philippines, the population in rural and urban areas gradually increased, but there was not much movement from rural areas to urban areas. Both pull factor, which refers to industrialization in the cities, and push factor, which refers to unutilized labor, were absent in the Philippines. People in rural areas could not find the hope for employment in urban areas and did not have a capacity to send their children for education in urban areas. They just stick to the tenancy farming, employing older family members to increase the outputs with very low productivity. Educated and skillful labor is one of the most important factors for development, and education policy is central to social policy in a development context. Imperial Japan had a significant influence on the education system in Taiwan and South Korea, while the US had a significant influence on the education system in the Philippines. Both Imperial Japan and the US did better on the educational field compared to other European imperialism in Africa. However, the coverage and level of education was still insufficient for development, and South Korea and Taiwan made a significant effort to improve education system when they implemented land reform and agricultural reform and industrialization. The table shows how Korea and Taiwan made an effort to increase the coverage of the education at different levels of education. In the case of both South Korea and Taiwan, in particular, increase of the enrollment rate in upper secondary and tertiary education, private and public sector partnership played a significant role. Firstly, the government established various channels to increase the number of tertiary educations to produce teachers for primary and secondary schools. Secondly, government encouraged the private sector to establish secondary schools which have same curriculums and teachers with same qualifications as that of public secondary school through financial support and administrative regulation. As a result, although public sector has provided education to more than 98% of primary school students and more than 80% of lower secondary school students, upper secondary school education has become predominantly private. Important point is that there is not much difference between the school fees and quality of education between private and public secondary schools, except for a few special secondary schools. In contrast, the Philippines, even though they had higher level of coverage than South Korea and Taiwan in the 1950s, have not made an effort to improve the education system. The higher rate in tertiary education of the Philippines is the legacy of the U.S. colonialism in the Philippines, which emphasized the use of the Filipinos as the main player of governing the Philippines. In the case of Taiwan and South Korea, Japanese imperialists wanted to use Taiwanese and Koreans as just skillful laborers in labor-intensive industry, and tertiary education system was not well developed in Taiwan and South Korea compared to the Philippines. Vocational education is also an important policy area which constitutes a synergistic linkage with other policies for development. In the case of Korea, government spending on vocational training was increased even in the middle of oil crisis in the 1970s, as you can see in the graph. Two peaks in the 1970s indicate increase of expenditure on vocational training in South Korea, and these increases of expenditure on vocational training were taking place in both public sector and private sector. Fiscal policy is also an important policy area which constitutes the policy environment to significantly influence the welfare, in particular inequality issue. How much tax is collected from whom is one of the major issues affecting inequality. But one more important issue is where the tax is spent and how much it is spent. In the cases of Korea and Taiwan, which were both very much agriculture dominant economy, the government spent a lot of government resource on rural development to reduce the gap between the levels of living conditions of rural and urban areas. When the taxes from industrial sector increased, the government spent resource on rural development, more than what they collected from rural areas. It was, in fact, a transfer of resources government resources from urban areas to rural areas. The resources transferred from urban to rural areas were used to modernize rural areas and increase the productivity of agricultural sector. The government subsidized the development of high-yield varieties, the fertilizers, agricultural equipments and machines, and other agricultural reform process. Another policy to reduce the gap between rural and urban areas in terms of living conditions is price policy. In both South Korea and Taiwan, the governments made a significant effort to adjust agricultural price index to the manufacturing price index. It has two positive consequences. First, although the degree of actual impact is still in controversy, it contributed to curbing the inflation. Secondly, it played the role of automatic adjustment mechanism to reduce the gap between rural and urban areas by striking the balance between income levels of rural and urban areas. One of the key policy tools was the government purchase scheme of the agricultural products, which set the price in accordance with the manufacturing price index. Social movement is one of the neglected areas of social policy discourse, but social movements sometimes significantly affect the government's social policies, in particular land reform. In the case of Korea, government initiated New Village movement in both rural and urban areas from the early 1970s, which maximized the impact of land reform. It was designed as self-help movement of people with financial and administrative support for those self-help groups. In rural villages, people organized themselves and improved the living conditions with the resource support from the government. The needs of the village people were identified by people themselves, and they designed and implemented projects. In urban areas, similar process was established. Although the New Village movement contributed a lot to improving the living conditions in rural and urban areas, its initiation was top-down by the authoritarian government, and the long-term impact of the New Village movement is still in controversy. Then we will look at conventional welfare program development in South Korea. This slide shows the development of welfare programs in South Korea. The blue line shows how the compulsory education, public assistance, health insurance, work injury, pension, employment insurance, and old age long-term care have developed in terms of coverage and quality. And green line is the GDP growth rate in the similar period. It took about 30 years to reach the universal coverage, and as you can see in the graph, there are several different programs which started in different times in history. And the welfare programs have different trajectories in terms of speed of progress. Some programs developed very fast in terms of coverage and quality, while others developed relatively in slow speed. I'd like to highlight two programs development. First one is health insurance. Health insurance program started in the early 1960s when Korean government started the first economic plan for industrialization. And it was just after the land reform too. So in a way, the government started industrial policy and health policy and land reform at the same time. And the other program is the employment insurance program, which significantly increased its coverage during the Asian financial crisis and achieved the universal coverage during the financial crisis. The Korean government established and used universal unemployment insurance as a key tool to address financial crisis. My presentation so far has focused on the good sides of South Korea and Taiwanese experiences. Learning from these experiences needs some cautions. It is because several conditions of developing countries have these days are different from what I just described. Firstly, the nature and attributes of the developing countries' social, economic, political, and cultural conditions are diverse. They are not the same as those of South Korea and Taiwan of the 1960s and 1970s, when they started land reform and developing social policies and economic policies. And secondly, developing countries today have knowledge and lessons which were not available to South Korea and Taiwan of the 1960s and 1970s. In a way, developing countries today are in a better position to design social and economic policies since they can avoid mistakes South Korea and Taiwan made in the 1960s and the 1970s. Developing countries today can also skip the long process of development with a better design policy. In this sense, I'd like to suggest focusing on the following 4 big lessons. Firstly, it is possible to have policies to reduce inequality and achieve high economic growth at the same time. The relationship between inequality and growth is still a very much controversial issue in scholarly debate. But in the longer term, from the experiences of South Korea and Taiwan, we can understand with well-designed policies, developing countries can reduce inequality and achieve high economic growth, which consequently improve the governance. Secondly, transformative social policy perspective, which concerns various aspects of development, such as production, redistribution, protection, reproduction, and social cohesion, can significantly help policymakers to create policy packages for development in which all the policies are interlinked with each other to create synergies. Thirdly, as I mentioned, it is quite important to avoid mistakes of the already developed countries. In the cases of South Korea and Taiwan, the lack of democracy was one of the major problems in their development processes. All the policies were top-down, and people's freedom was often suppressed. And there were not many channels through which people could participate in the policy design. I think it is possible to avoid these mistakes, and we should be innovative and creative to make good policies in democratic manner. East Asian development is often described as developmental states or authoritarian developmental states. I think in the 21st century, it is possible to have inclusive and democratic developmental states. Lastly, in the climate change crisis, we have to concern about environment, and environment issue should be incorporated in policy design and implementation. Climate change crisis is fundamental crisis at the global level, and all the development policies should take into account ecological concern in their development plans and policies. And social policy also should take into account this ecological concern. The concepts and discourses on eco-social policies or eco-social contract can guide us to find more innovative solutions to ecological as well as social problems from the perspective of transformative social policy. This slide introduces key references which are used to prepare this presentation. If you are interested in more detailed explanation on various issues I dealt with during the presentation, I strongly recommend you reading these materials. Thank you for your attention. I'll be open to your questions and comments. Thank you.